Night settled over Brimvale like a slow-closing curtain, swallowing the last traces of sunlight until only a deep blue twilight remained. On the hill above the valley, Hawthorne Hall glowed with the light of 100 lanterns. From a distance, it looked less like a home and more like a beacon, golden, proud, and unaware of the storm gathering around it. Carriages rolled up the stone path one after another, wheels crunching over gravel as elegantly dressed guests stepped out, their laughter rising into the crisp night air. Lanterns swayed gently overhead, their warm light dancing across polished shoes, silk gloves, and faces that knew nothing of hardship. Music drifted from inside the hall, soft and playful, weaving through the courtyard like a ribbon of joy. But behind the brightness, moving through the edges of lantern light, was a man the guests never noticed. He walked with steadiness, with quiet purpose, carrying trays, adjusting candles, and guiding workers who moved quickly to keep the celebration flawless. His name was Corin, though almost no one ever spoke it aloud. To the guests, he was simply another pair of hands, another shadow in their perfect night. Corin paused under the main archway, where the lanterns hung heavy and warm. Their flames flickered in the thin breeze, trembling like they wanted to speak. He watched the people gathering inside the hall, the silk, the jewels, the bright smiles that stretched easily across faces that had never known the weight of obedience. He stood still for a moment, letting the wind brush against his face. In its coolness, there was something he recognized. A warning. A whisper. A shift in the air that didn't belong to celebration. Lantern light rippled across the courtyard as the wind strengthened, making every flame dance in small bursts. Guests glanced up at the sky, but laughed it off, unconcerned. They cared only for the feast, the music, the spectacle of the night. The hall had always been their fortress of comfort, but Corin had lived in its bones. Long enough to feel when something was changing, he lifted another stack of plates, set them neatly along the large banquet table, and stepped aside as 2 more carriages arrived. People hurried past him without a glance, brushing his shoulder, dropping their coats into his arms. Speaking to him only in commands, he didn't react. He didn't flinch. He didn't break the rhythm that years of discipline had carved into him, but inside, something was quietly tightening. The storm rolled again in the distance, a low growl that trembled through the earth. The lanterns responded with a shiver of light. Corin looked toward the horizon, dark clouds gathering slowly, swallowing the moon. Swallowing the stars, the hall glowed brighter against the coming storm. As if trying to fight the night itself, people kept arriving. Voices grew louder, music grew richer. And Corin kept moving, calm and silent, blending into the very structure of the celebration. Yet if someone had watched closely, really watched, they might have seen the difference in his steps tonight. They might have sensed the stillness in his eyes. They might have understood that this was not just another evening for him, but no one noticed. Not yet. The lanterns flickered again, harder this time. A spark dropped. A soft hiss rose where it landed, and the night, for a moment too brief for the guests to feel, held its breath. Dawn had not yet broken, but Hawthorne Hall was already alive with movement. The faintest gray light seeped across the valley, casting long shadows over the estate grounds. It was the kind of morning that felt heavy even before the sun touched it. As if the earth knew something was stirring beneath the surface, Corin stepped out into the courtyard, with a wooden basin in his hands. The cold air clung to him, settling into his breath, into his bones. Workers passed him in hurried lines, carrying sacks of grain, polishing lantern glass, scrubbing down the stone steps where last night's footprints still lingered. The grand celebration was not over. It had merely paused. Inside the hall, the elite still slept in their rooms, wrapped in soft blankets, unaware of the world waking around them. But Corin could hear their footsteps in his mind, the demands they would bark when they rose, the expectations that would return as soon as the first bell rang. He set the basin beside the well and drew fresh water. Every movement was practiced, efficient, but his eyes wandered toward the garden terrace, where the hall's master and mistress often held their morning councils. Their voices carried easily through the stone arches, sharp and certain, Echoing down toward the workers below. Today, those voices were already awake. Corin listened without turning his head. The tone alone was enough. Frustration, entitlement, plans for another lavish event before the lanterns from the first were even cold. He walked the basin toward the back kitchen doors, passing the servants' quarters, simple wooden rooms lined in narrow rows. Over the years, Corin had watched countless workers sleep, wake, live, and fade away within those walls. Some left willingly, some left quietly. Some never left at all, but Corin remained. The kitchen doors swung open, releasing warm air scented with bread and boiling herbs. Workers moved in a steady rhythm, kneading, chopping, stirring, creating morning meals for 100 guests, who would barely taste them before asking for something finer. Corin stepped inside and set the basin down. A younger worker glanced at him, her eyes carrying the same tiredness he carried. "You hear them already?" she whispered, nodding toward the terrace. Corin didn't answer. He didn't need to. She knew. "They're planning something big," she continued, voice low. "Bigger than last night." He wiped his hands on a cloth and looked out toward the hall's main corridor, its long, polished floors reflecting the fading lanterns overhead. The storm clouds from the night before had not passed. They lingered like a warning, heavy and unmoving. A bell echoed suddenly, ringing through the entire estate. It was sharp, metallic, cutting through the morning calm. The guests were waking. The servants straightened instantly, hands moving faster, voices silencing, the weight of the day settling on their shoulders like a familiar chain. Corin stepped out of the kitchen and into the main hallway. Footsteps gathered above him, doors opening, chatter rising. Hawthorne Hall was waking too loud, demanding. Ungrateful, Corin walked forward with steady steps. But something different pulsed beneath him. He was no longer just moving through the hall. He was listening to it, feeling it, measuring every corner, every doorway, every weakness carved into its stone. The celebration had started last night, but the storm, the real storm, was only beginning to form. And as the bell's echo faded across the hallways, the air tightened around him, as if the building itself sensed the shift. Something was coming. Something the hall was not prepared to meet. The moment the door slipped open, warm golden light washed over Ellison's face, a sharp contrast to the cold determination in his eyes. The great dining hall stretched before him in a glittering spectacle of excess. Chandeliers burned with rows of trembling candles, long tables overflowed with roasted meats and sugared fruits, and laughter ricocheted between the marble pillars like a mockery of everything he had endured. Not a single guest noticed him. They were too drunk, too loud, too buried in their own arrogance. Women fanned themselves dramatically. Men boasted about land, wealth, and the obedience of those they commanded. The sound of silverware clattering, glasses clinking, and chairs scraping filled the space like a storm of carelessness. Behind Ellison, Lila stepped forward, swallowing hard. Her breath shook, but she did not waver. Jonah followed, carrying the heavy cane knife low at his side, the blade reflecting the flicker of the candles. They moved along the far wall, unseen. Years of being invisible in this house had trained them well, too well. They could walk through a crowd without leaving a single ripple. They could stand behind a man and he'd never turn around. Their existence had been erased by cruelty, and that erasure was now their armor. A pair of guests stumbled past them, laughing about a prank played on a servant earlier that day. Ellison's knuckles tightened around the machete handle just for a moment, then loosened. Not yet. Their plan needed precision, timing, silence. At the front of the hall, the mistress rose to speak, tapping a silver spoon against her glass. The room fell into a hush, brief, unsteady, but quiet enough that her voice carried. "Tonight," she announced, "we celebrate another year of prosperity. Another year of loyalty. Another year where this house stands unmatched." Applause erupted. Ellison's gaze locked onto her. Her hair was pinned high, jewels catching the candlelight. Her gown shimmered as she lifted her chin, pride radiating from every gesture. Then she said the words that made Lila's hands curl into fists. "And to those who serve us." She paused, smiling. "May they always remember their place." A murmur of smug approval rippled through the room. Leela's breath cracked. She looked at Ellison not for reassurance but for permission. Ellison shook his head gently. Not yet. Not in chaos. In justice. He motioned toward the side of the hall where 2 guards stood, distracted, yawning, leaning against the wall. Their job was to watch the servants, but the wine had softened their senses. Jonah took position behind a column near them, waiting for Ellison's cue. Ellison moved deeper into the hall, blending into the dimness beneath the chandeliers. Every step was a test of the years he had survived. Every breath was a reminder of the hundreds of nights he had dreamed of this moment, only to bury it again for fear of losing what little life he had left. But tonight the chains were gone. Tonight the ground trembled for a different reason. The mistress lifted her glass again. "Let the music play," violins screeched back to life. Servants, real servants, the ones who had never known rest, rushed forward to refill drinks, too terrified to hesitate. Ellison watched them. He saw their shaking hands, their hollow eyes, their quiet surrender. It hardened something inside him. He stepped back into the corridor for a breath of cold air, and Lila went with him. "They're monsters," she whispered, voice trembling. "Every last one of them." Ellison's reply came slow, controlled. They made themselves untouchable for years. But even the untouchable must answer when the past knocks on their door. Jonah appeared beside them, nodding once. "It's time," he said. Ellison looked back at the glowing hall, at the crowds feasting, the music soaring, the mistress beaming beneath the chandeliers, and he felt the night shift, a tension in the air, a tightening of fate. The first step had been silence. The next would be thunder. And as they slipped back into the hall, shadows clinging to their heels, the music masked the quiet storm rising behind them. A storm waiting only for Ellison's signal to break. That signal was coming. Soon. Very soon. The grand dining hall of Grayson Hollow thrummed with careless energy. Candles flickered in crystal holders, casting golden shadows across faces flushed with wine and indulgence. Laughter spilled over the tables, rich and oblivious. The music played on, a string of notes rising and falling like a heartbeat, carrying the celebration into the high arches and polished floorboards. No one paused, no one noticed. No one imagined the quiet figures moving along the edges of the room, shadows against shadows, carrying the weight of years of hidden suffering. Ellison Ward led the small trio, Leela and Jonah, close behind through the maze of tables and revelers. Their movements were precise, deliberate. The crowd's attention was elsewhere, absorbed in the mistress's dazzling display, in the clink of goblets, in the shallow jokes of men who thought themselves untouchable. The servants who flitted through the room, carrying platters and trays, were invisible to those who commanded them. Tonight, that invisibility would become power. Ellison's eyes swept the hall. He noted every loose hinge, every unguarded path, every blind spot where the footmen and guards trusted routine over vigilance. 7 long years of careful observation, memorization of patterns, and patient waiting had led to this night. Every glance, every tilt of a head, every whisper of a footfall had been logged, catalogued, and stored for a moment such as this. A single mistake could ruin everything. But nothing had been left to chance. The mistress rose from her chair, pearls bouncing with her movement. She tapped her silver spoon against her glass, the metallic ring cutting through the din of music. The room hushed, obedient as if trained for this single gesture. To a night of splendor? To the finest hall in all of Brimvale. To those who serve faithfully, she announced, her smile sharp as a blade. She lifted her glass higher. And may those who serve never forget their place. A ripple of approval and laughter rose through the guests. Ellison's jaw tightened, but he did not move. He did not flinch. The trio pressed along the shadowed edges, unnoticed, their focus absolute. Every gesture, every sigh, every step had meaning. At the far end of the hall, near the side doors that led to the kitchens, the plan began to take shape. The hidden lever Ellison had loosened weeks ago, the one in the floor beneath the long table, was within reach. A single press would unlock a passage, one the guests had never considered, one that bypassed guards and sent them straight into the heart of their own complacency. Jonah moved slightly, aligning himself near the first distracted guard, eyes sharp, Layla's hands trembled for only a moment before steadying, resting lightly on the sideboard as she waited for Ellison's signal. He glanced at her, then at the mistress, then back at the glowing rows of guests. The air shifted, it always did before a reckoning. The flames above flickered, almost in rhythm with Ellison's heartbeat, casting long, wavering shadows across the floor. The orchestra played on, oblivious, creating a perfect cover for what was coming. The room seemed to inhale, a collective pause before the inevitable exhale of chaos. Ellison crouched near the floorboard. With a slow, deliberate movement, he pressed the lever. A soft click echoed beneath the polished boards. The door that led to the hidden passage eased open with a whisper. The darkness beyond waited patiently, a tunnel carved in silence, ready to carry them unseen. He rose, eyes scanning, chest steady. Every guest was still entranced by the mistress's speech, still oblivious to the gap forming in their carefully constructed world. Even the guards, confident in their inebriation, paid no attention to the corridor that would soon guide the reckoning into the hall itself. Layla exhaled softly, a release she hadn't realized she had been holding for years. Jonah nodded, gripping his makeshift tool, not with aggression, but with purpose. Ellison stepped forward, lantern light reflecting in his eyes, and moved toward the edge of the hall. The first step had been silence, the second careful observation. Now, the third step, the one that would pull the hidden tide forward, was ready. The music swelled again, louder this time, as if the hall itself were celebrating its own ignorance. Ellison looked across the sea of faces, noting the vanity, the indulgence, the careless sense of safety. And he knew that tonight every illusion would end. The storm outside rumbled faintly, a low growl that seemed distant yet near, echoing the tension gathering inside the walls. Lanterns flickered once more, shadows stretching, dancing, and waiting. The air hung thick, expectant. The first ripple of justice was ready to ripple through the gold and glass of Grayson Hollow. Ellison raised a steady hand toward the hidden door, and in that gesture, in that pause, the night itself seemed to shiver. The guests did not know it yet, but the world they had taken for granted was about to change forever. The reckoning had begun. The music thundered through the hall, drowning out the soft footfalls of those who moved in the shadows. Ellison, Layla, and Jonah crept along the sideboard, bodies pressed against the walls where candlelight barely reached. Every laugh, every clink of glass, every careless shout from the guests became a cover for the quiet storm forming behind the gilded doors. The hidden passage yawned like a secret mouth, waiting to swallow the trespassers of their own privilege. Ellison's eyes swept the hall, noting the distractions, the drunken man staggering too close to the edge of the table, the woman tipping her glass to catch a flirtatious smile from her neighbor, the guards leaning against the columns, convinced their authority was untouchable. All of them thought the night was theirs. All of them believed in their invincibility. Jonah pressed a finger to his lips, signaling silence, and they paused. Layla's hand brushed against the polished wood of the sideboard. She felt the pulse of the hall in that touch, the arrogance, the vanity, the years of cruelty distilled into a single moment. It made her tremble, but her legs did not falter. She had rehearsed this night in her mind for so long that fear had no claim over her. Only purpose remained. Ellison stepped forward, just enough to reach the floorboard he had loosened months ago. A subtle shift, a soft click. The door beneath the table moved silently, unseen by the revelers above. It led into a shadowed corridor, a hidden path that wound beneath the very floorboards of Grayson Hollow, bypassing every guard, every drunken guest, every assumption of safety. He motioned to Layla and Jonah. They moved swiftly, sliding into the corridor with careful precision. Behind the walls, the air was cool and damp, smelling faintly of earth and old timber. It was a stark contrast to the gold, the warmth, and the laughter above. Here, in the quiet, the memory of years past pressed down on them, the toil, the obedience, the endless servitude that had gone unacknowledged. The corridor narrowed. Ellison led them through it like a shadow moving with intent. Each step brought them closer to the hall's unsuspecting heart. The distant sound of violins continued above, but down here it became a faint echo, almost swallowed by the thick silence. Every fiber of Ellison's being was attuned to the rhythm of the house, to the patterns that had been drilled into him for a lifetime. Emerging near the back of the dining hall, the trio paused behind a heavy curtain. The guests were oblivious, caught in their drunken stupor. The mistress had returned to the head of the table, raising her glass in triumph, unaware that the quietest figures in her house had finally taken notice. Ellison's eyes swept across the room, catching each expression of vanity, greed, and careless dominance. The air itself seemed to thrum with anticipation. He nodded to Jonah. Layla mirrored the gesture. Together, they moved toward the edge of the room, a river of shadows flowing through the light. The guests remained blind, hearing only music, laughter, and their own voices. Every detail Ellison had memorized. Their habits, the turns of their heads, the sway of their movements worked in their favor now. The first faint tremor of fear had yet to touch the hall above, but it was coming. The invisible presence of those who had been forgotten for decades pressed against the walls, a silent reckoning. Every candle flickered in subtle unison, as though the light itself sensed the shift. Ellison's hand rested briefly on the nearest table leg, steadying himself. He inhaled, the scent of roasted meats and polished wood filling his senses, a reminder of all that had been endured and stolen. Tonight that weight would be acknowledged not with rage but with precision, with inevitability. A soft footstep above, almost missed, alerted him that one of the guests had wandered closer to the corridor. Ellison froze. Time slowed. Even the music seemed to hesitate. Then, just as silently, the footstep moved away, leaving the revelry untouched and unaware. The storm had circled the hall, gathering strength unseen, waiting for the perfect moment to unfold. And as the candles trembled in their holders, as the music played on, and as the mistress raised her glass once more, Ellison knew the night had reached its final preparation. The balance was poised on the edge. The quiet storm was ready to strike. The hall was alive with false celebration. The mistress's laughter echoed off the polished walls, a sharp, brittle sound that carried over the chatter and clinking of glasses. Guests leaned back in their chairs, oblivious to the shadows gathering at the edges of their golden world. They had danced, eaten, and boasted for hours, convinced that the night belonged entirely to them. They did not notice the quiet figures moving just beyond the glow of candlelight. Ellison, Layla, and Jonah, invisible to all but the darkness. Ellison's eyes traced the hall, memorizing every face, every movement, every hint of carelessness. The guests were predictable, too comfortable, too drunk with entitlement to notice the shift in the air. He paused for a moment at the edge of the sideboard, fingers brushing lightly over the polished surface. The warmth of the hall seeped into him, a reminder of all the years spent bending under its golden light, all the quiet endurance of a life erased. Layla followed closely, her small hand gripping a hidden tool beneath her skirts. She had trained herself to move silently, to breathe in sync with Ellison, to step when he stepped. Years of obedience had taught her how to vanish in plain sight, and tonight that skill would become their strength. Jonah trailed slightly behind, a shadow in his own right, keeping a watchful eye on the nearest drunk guard leaning lazily against a column. None of the occupants noticed them. None suspected the quiet reckoning inching closer. Ellison crouched beside the final obstruction, a low, carved panel near the head of the table that concealed the entrance to the servants' forgotten passage. With careful fingers, he pressed the mechanism he had prepared months ago. A soft click echoed beneath the floorboards, swallowed almost instantly by the music and laughter above. The hidden door swung open just enough for them to slip through, a dark slit into the underbelly of the hall, bypassing every assumption of safety and every watchful eye. Inside the narrow corridor, the air was cool and damp, carrying the scent of earth and old timber. Every step forward pressed them deeper into the space between worlds, the gilded illusions of the hall above and the quiet, long-suffering reality beneath. Lila exhaled softly, feeling the tension of years lift slightly from her shoulders, replaced by something heavier, resolve. Jonah's hands tightened around the tool he carried, not with anger, but with a patient certainty that comes only from endurance. Emerging behind the head table, the trio paused. The mistress and her favored guests were still laughing, still toasting their own cleverness, still oblivious to the invisible storm now poised directly behind them. Ellison stepped forward, carefully measuring the distance, calculating the perfect moment. Every detail he had memorized, the sway of a guest's head, the tilt of a chair, the way the mistress raised her glass, worked in his favor. Time slowed. Even the music seemed to hesitate, carrying its notes like warnings into the shadows. Ellison lifted a hand, signaling Jonah and Lila to spread quietly along the periphery. They melted into the space with deliberate patience, pressing the edge of tables, blending with the dark corners, invisible as ghosts. Above them, the candles flickered, their flames dancing as if they sensed the presence of a long-forgotten justice. The guests remained unaware. Their arrogance and indulgence had blinded them, making the hall a stage for what was about to unfold. Ellison's chest rose and fell steadily, his mind attuned to every heartbeat in the room, every whispered breath, every careless movement. In his calm lay the power accumulated from years of being unseen. He paused at the center of the hidden corridor, taking one final glance at the mistress. Her smile, radiant and unguarded, carried no hint of the reckoning closing in. Ellison's hand rested lightly on the polished edge of the table, steady and unyielding. Tonight, every facade of control, every laugh, every gleaming jewel would be confronted not with mindless violence, but with the weight of the invisible, the patient, and the long-suffering. The air thickened. The hall seemed to inhale in anticipation. Every shadow, every flicker of candlelight, every vibration in the floorboards became part of the moment. Ellison lifted his head, signaling Lila and Jonah once more. The night held its breath. The invisible storm was ready. And then, with a single silent step, Ellison Ward moved into the space above, where the oblivious revelers waited, marking the beginning of a night they would never forget. The hall glowed with a golden haze, candles trembling as if sensing the tension in the air. Music continued, sweet and careless, rising from the orchestra pit at the far end, a soundtrack for a night that had never belonged to the guests, yet they took it for granted. Ellison, Layla, and Jonah moved with quiet intent along the periphery, shadows within shadows, unseen but fully present. Each step was measured, every movement deliberate, a dance perfected over years of silent endurance. Ellison's eyes swept the room. The mistress sat at the head of the table, laughing, radiant, completely oblivious to the storm gathering just behind her. Her guests leaned back in their chairs, sipping wine, praising each other, proud of their wealth, their power, their presumed control. None of them noticed the invisible figures at the edges of their world, figures forged in patience, forged in suffering, forged in silence. He paused for a moment, feeling the air shift around him, thickening with anticipation. The hall itself seemed to hold its breath. Lila mirrored his pause, fingers resting lightly on a sideboard, catching the faintest reflection of candlelight. Jonah lingered near the nearest column, eyes sharp, chest tight with controlled energy. Each of them knew the delicate balance of timing, the careful orchestration required. One misstep could destroy the moment. Ellison's hand brushed the polished surface of the table near the mistress. Years of observation had taught him every weakness, every gap in their vigilance. The doors behind the orchestra, the careless shuffle of the footmen, the swaying of a drunk guard, all these tiny details were threads in a tapestry that tonight would unravel. He nodded subtly to Layla, who shifted slightly, melting into the shadows closer to the unsuspecting guests. Jonah mirrored the gesture, moving into position without a sound. Above them, the music swelled. A violin screeched a high note, almost like a warning. The mistress raised her glass, beaming, pearls glittering in the candlelight. To prosperity and to those who serve faithfully? Her voice rang with triumph, echoing across the hall. Guests lifted their glasses, clinking them together in careless merriment, unaware that the floor beneath them was no longer just wood and marble, it was the threshold of reckoning. Ellison's jaw tightened. The years of hidden pain, the weight of silence, the endless endurance of cruelty all converged in this moment. He exhaled slowly, the air cool against his skin, carrying the scent of roasted meats and polished wood. He stepped lightly forward, the polished floorboards beneath his boots reflecting the candlelight. carrying him silently into the space behind the head table. A faint shadow moved across the wall, unnoticed by the revelers. Ellison followed it, reaching the edge of the hidden corridor he had unlocked weeks ago. The panel swung slightly, revealing the darkness beyond, a path to confront the heart of the arrogance and indifference above. He glanced at Lila and Jonah. They nodded, synchronized in breath and intent. Tonight, the invisible would become inevitable. Ellison took a slow step into the hall proper, gliding along the edge of the tables, unseen yet present, the pulse of years of planning guiding him. The guests laughed, raising glasses, toasts they thought eternal, unaware that their own indulgence had made them vulnerable. Every table leg, every spilled drop of wine, every discarded napkin was a part of the stage they had built unknowingly for their own reckoning. The room seemed to shift subtly. Candles flickered, casting long shadows that stretched toward Ellison as if reaching for the moment to strike. Music played louder, faster, the sound vibrating against the polished walls, masking the silent movement of those who had suffered and waited. The mistress's laughter rang high, fragile in its certainty. Ellison paused just behind the mistress, feeling the weight of the room's ignorance pressing down on him. His hand hovered above the hidden lever, the mechanism that would bring the final sequence into motion. Every guest, every smile, every jewel and gilded plate was oblivious to the tide rising against them. Tonight, their ignorance would meet its consequence. The hall trembled, not from wind or music, but from the quiet, controlled presence of the storm that had been waiting 20 years to arrive. Ellison inhaled, steady, certain. The first ripple of change had already begun, unseen but unstoppable, poised to transform the night into a reckoning no soul present would ever forget. And as he prepared to press forward, the air hung heavy with anticipation. The guests remained blissfully unaware. But in the shadows, the tide of justice moved inexorably toward them, ready to surge. The first strike of the night's reckoning was seconds away. The hall vibrated with music and laughter, yet beneath that false gaiety, a silent storm was awakening. Ellison moved along the side of the grand table, shadow blending with shadow, a phantom in the golden light. Lila followed, her small hands gripping the edge of a chair for balance, eyes fixed on the mistress whose vanity had blinded her for decades. Jonah remained close behind, steady, like the heartbeat of inevitability. Above them, the guests reveled in indulgence. Goblets overflowed, laughter rang out carelessly, and every word spoken carried arrogance and entitlement. They believed the night was theirs, that their power was unchallenged, uncheckable. The mistress raised her glass for yet another toast, pearls glittering with pride, voice sharp and triumphant. "To prosperity, to our unmatched legacy." The crowd echoed her words, voices melding into a chorus of self-congratulation. Ellison paused, feeling the weight of the moment press against him. Years of silent endurance, of bearing humiliation and cruelty had led to this precise instant. Every shadow, every whisper of air, every flicker of candlelight seemed to align with his intent. The invisible had waited long enough. Tonight it would make itself seen. He reached the floorboard beneath the head table, the mechanism he had prepared long ago resting silently beneath his palm. One soft press and the hidden passage would open, granting access to a vantage the guests could never anticipate. It was a careful, deliberate motion, executed with patience and precision, as if the room itself were holding its breath. Layla's eyes darted nervously to the mistress, who leaned back, unaware of the threat inching closer. Jonah steadied her with a slight touch, signaling patience. Every gesture, every silent instruction carried the weight of long-planned justice. The hall above thrummed with oblivion, every note of music, every clink of silverware, every careless laugh serving as a mask for the storm hidden just behind the walls. The first ripple of unease passed unnoticed among the guests. Ellison stepped forward into a dim corner near the orchestra, his form swallowed by shadow. The candles flickered as if warning, casting long shapes across the polished floor. Music soared, covering even the faintest sound of movement, while the trio positioned themselves along the perimeter, ready to converge when the moment arrived. The mistress's laughter rang sharp. "Bring more wine," she commanded, oblivious. The servants scurried to obey, faces pale with fear, hands trembling. Ellison noticed the smallest details, the staggered steps of the drunk guard, the tilt of the chandelier casting shadows across the floor, the way a guest leaned too far back in his chair. Every misstep of arrogance was a thread they could pull to unravel the night. A sudden hush seemed to ripple through the hall, subtle and nearly imperceptible, like the silence before a storm breaks. Ellison's hand hovered near the lever, the tension coiling inside him. Years of planning, decades of patience, centuries of suffering embodied in this single act. Justice did not rush. Justice waited, and now it was poised to act. The hidden passage shifted slightly beneath the floorboards, opening with a sound no one above would notice. The corridor beyond stretched like a secret vein leading to the heart of the hall. Ellison signaled to Layla and Jonah, and they advanced quietly, merging with the shadows as one presence. Tonight, the invisible would strike where no one expected, and the power that had been thought absolute would face a reckoning it could not ignore. Ellison paused behind a pillar near the mistress, watching her radiant smile, her unguarded pride. One step, one shift, and the delicate tension of the room would tip. The air hung heavy with anticipation. Every candle flicker, every echo of music, every subtle breath carried the promise of change. The storm had arrived in the smallest, quietest form, waiting to unfurl its full force. And in that breathless moment, before a single move was made, the hall itself seemed to pause. Every soul above remained blind to the tide rolling toward them, a tide of invisible patience and inexorable justice. The night held its breath. The reckoning was seconds away. The golden glow of the dining hall flickered as if uncertain, dancing across polished tables stacked with untouched feasts. Guests laughed, oblivious, celebrating their own power, their own comfort, their own invincibility. They did not hear the subtle creak beneath the floorboards, did not notice the shadows moving like whispers along the walls, and certainly did not suspect that the quietest figures of the household, those who had suffered and endured in silence, were about to step into the fullness of their reckoning. Ellison Ward moved at the edge of the hall, careful, deliberate, invisible to the revelers who had once dictated his life with cruelty and indifference. His hand rested lightly on the floorboard that concealed the passage he had unlocked weeks ago. One careful press and the mechanism shifted, a hidden door revealing a narrow corridor. The three figures, the embodiment of patience and silent strength, slipped through, emerging unseen behind the head table where the mistress sat, radiant and commanding. The room continued to sing with laughter and music, unaware of the invisible tide approaching. The mistress raised her glass once more, pearls glinting in candlelight, and called for another toast. Ellison's eyes met hers, briefly no anger, no hatred, only a calm, resolute inevitability. The years of endurance, of unacknowledged suffering, of quiet observation and preparation had brought him here. The balance of power was about to shift. Leela and Jonah spread along the edges of the tables, shadows among shadows, each movement precise. The guards, drunk and inattentive, leaned against the walls, their confidence as fragile as crystal. Every subtle misstep, every lapse in vigilance had been catalogued and memorized by Ellison. He had watched. He had waited. And now the invisible force of long-suppressed justice was about to manifest. Ellison signaled with the slightest motion. Lila pressed forward toward the nearest distraction, a spilled goblet, a stumbling guest guiding the first ripple of disruption. Jonah moved to intercept a guard drifting too close to their hidden corridor. No sound, no alarm, only the quiet assertion of control. The hall, so full of arrogance, began to feel the first weight of something it had never expected, the consequences of years ignored, cruelty observed, and endurance transformed into quiet power. The mistress's smile faltered for a brief, imperceptible moment. She adjusted a pearl necklace, sensing perhaps only a shift in the air, a subtle tension threading through the hall. She had ruled with confidence, sure that no one dared defy her. But centuries of patience, centuries of unseen suffering, were now moving just beyond her reach. Ellison stepped closer, his shadow stretching across the polished floorboards. The guests were still distracted by music, wine, and each other. And yet, beneath the veneer of merriment, a current of change flowed, silent but undeniable. Every step Ellison took was a testament to restraint and strategy, a reminder that power could be reclaimed not with chaos but with calculated precision. The first movement of recognition passed through the hall like a pulse. A guard stiffened, a guest glanced around nervously, a whisper of fear touched a few faces. Ellison remained calm, steady, his eyes fixed on the mistress. The years of unseen planning culminated in this single moment, every detail accounted for, every shadow aligned, every step deliberate. Then, as if the world itself had inhaled, the music faltered, the laughter stumbled, and the invisible current became undeniable. The guests shifted in confusion. They looked for answers in each other's eyes. Their certainty, once unshakable, began to crumble. Ellison's presence, quiet and controlled, radiated authority earned through endurance. The hall, a kingdom of indulgence, now trembled under the weight of its own arrogance. Ellison, Layla, and Jonah moved as one, not to harm, but to claim the justice that had been denied for decades. The tide of the night swept through the room, a reminder that even the invisible, the oppressed, and the patient hold power when endurance meets timing. And in that charged golden light with shadows stretching across every face, the mistress finally realized that the night was no longer hers. The feast, the laughter, the arrogance, all of it, the balance had shifted. And in the hush that followed, the hall seemed to exhale, heavy with the recognition of a justice long delayed, long prepared, and now finally delivered. The storm had passed silently, yet its imprint lingered. The invisible had spoken. The reckoning was complete. The golden haze of the dining hall had shifted. Candlelight no longer danced carelessly. Shadows stretched long and deliberate, crawling across polished floors like fingers pointing to truths long ignored. The music faltered, a violin screeching off-key as if sensing the tension now thick in the room. Guests glanced nervously at one another, laughter dying on their tongues. Ellison, Layla, and Jonah moved silently among the tables, their presence invisible but undeniable, an unseen current rewriting the hierarchy of the night. Ellison's gaze swept the hall. Faces once smug with entitlement now flickered with uncertainty. The mistress, perched at the head of the table, held her glass frozen mid-toast. Pearls glittered like fragments of false confidence, her smile faltering as the air around her pulsed with quiet authority. Ellison did not rush. He had waited decades for this, and he knew the most devastating strikes of justice were measured, precise, inevitable. Layla edged along the side of the table, her eyes sharp, breath controlled. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the release of years of suppressed fury. Every footstep, every glance was deliberate. Each subtle movement carried the weight of memory, of suffering endured silently, and of knowledge that the balance of power had finally shifted. Jonah's position near the rear of the hall was crucial. He observed the guards, their drunken arrogance finally colliding with the realization that they were vulnerable, unprepared, unseen currents moving beneath their feet. One guard, just beginning to notice the shifting atmosphere, froze, sensing the presence that had been invisible for so long. Ona remained calm, the embodiment of controlled patience, letting the tension ripple without rushing it. Ellison advanced slowly toward the mistress. The distance seemed immense, measured not in feet but in decades of pain and endurance. He paused near a heavy chair, hand resting lightly on the polished wood. The room seemed to hold its breath, the air thickening like fog in the dead of night. The guests' glances darted nervously now, whispers beginning to rise as confusion set in. For the first time, they realized that the night did not belong to them entirely. A servant's tray rattled, drawing attention to the edge of the hall where Leela stood. A guest's eyes widened. The first sparks of recognition that something had shifted appeared, faint but undeniable. Ellison felt the weight of centuries of suppression in that moment, the unacknowledged labor, the silenced voices, the patience of those forced into invisibility, and he knew that this subtle shift was the most powerful weapon of all. The mistress rose from her chair, instinctively aware that the air had changed. She clutched her pearls, voice tight as she called, "What? What is happening?" Her words rang hollow against the tide of inevitability pressing around her. Ellison's shadow stretched across the floor toward her, a reminder of every insult, every injustice, every forced bow and curtsy she had ever demanded. Lila stepped slightly closer, the candlelight catching her determined eyes. Jonah mirrored her motion, moving to block any retreat. The hall, once a kingdom of arrogance and indulgence, now teetered on the edge of revelation. Every guest felt the tension, some instinctively, others vaguely, as if the walls themselves were pressing in. Ellison paused, hand hovering near the hidden lever, the final mechanism that would bring the night to its conclusion. The room's heartbeat seemed to sync with his own, a collective pulse of expectation and fear. Silence fell heavier than the music, heavier than the golden glow above. The invisible storm had become unstoppable. The mistress finally caught her reflection in the polished silverware, her gaze flicking to the shadows converging around her. For the first time, certainty fled from her eyes, replaced by a fragile recognition that the night had been borrowed and that what had waited in silence was now here. Ellison's lips barely moved, whispering to Lila and Jonah, "Now." A ripple of action began, subtle but unyielding. Shadows pressed closer, the invisible tide surged. The Golden Hall, once a monument to indulgence and arrogance, felt the weight of justice long denied. And in that charged, trembling moment, every reveler understood, too late, that patience and endurance, when harnessed, wielded a power no jewel, no gold, no authority could withstand. The reckoning, long held in quiet, had arrived. The hall had transformed. Golden candlelight flickered across faces now etched with shock, confusion, and awe. The laughter that had once filled the air was gone, replaced by the heavy, almost tangible silence of recognition. Ellison, Layla, and Jonah moved through the room like shadows made flesh, their presence undeniable yet measured, carrying the weight of decades of silent suffering now finally turned toward justice. The mistress stood frozen at the head of the table, pearls glinting in the flickering light, her glass still raised in mid-air. Her eyes, once full of arrogance and certainty, now darted nervously from shadow to shadow, catching the subtle movements of those she had once deemed invisible. Every gesture, every glance, every carefully constructed layer of power had dissolved under the quiet, patient force that had entered her domain unseen. Ellison approached the center of the hall slowly, deliberately, each step resonating with years of observation and preparation. His eyes met hers, not with anger, not with vengeance, but with the steady, unyielding certainty of justice finally claimed. "It is time to acknowledge what has been unseen for too long," he murmured, voice calm but carrying across the hushed room. His words were simple, yet they struck deeper than any outburst could have. Layla moved closer to the mistress, her presence a quiet storm. The guests flinched as they saw her eyes, steady and unwavering. Every stolen glance, every whispered command, every act of quiet endurance was concentrated in that gaze. Jonah spread himself at the edges, ensuring no retreat. No illusion of control could survive the tide now flowing through the hall. The guests shifted uneasily, their authority evaporating like mist. The hall seemed smaller, the golden glow of wealth and indulgence now a cage. Their eyes, searching for answers, found only shadows and the subtle, controlled movements of those who had been hidden for decades. The silence was louder than music, heavier than the heaviest jewel-laden table, more commanding than the raised voices of the proud. Ellison raised a hand, and the subtle lever beneath the table clicked softly. The hidden mechanisms of the hall doors, passages, and unobserved spaces activated in a chain reaction, revealing the power of foresight and planning. Guests stumbled in confusion, their every assumption undone in moments, their world unraveling quietly yet completely. The mistress's voice trembled as she demanded explanations, but no answer came. The invisible had spoken, and it required no words. The trio moved together, deliberately and silently, a living embodiment of patience and endurance. Every step was a message, every glance a statement. No authority lasts forever when founded on cruelty and ignorance. The hall, once a monument to vanity, now bore witness to the inevitability of justice long delayed. Even the walls seemed to absorb the moment, shadows stretching long across the polished floors, flickering in unison with the new order now quietly established. Ellison stopped before the mistress, eyes steady, voice calm. Every moment you forgot to see us, every act you demanded in silence, every life you overlooked. It has all been remembered. Tonight it is acknowledged. The hall was heavy with understanding. No scream, no fight, no chaos, only recognition. Every guest now felt the invisible weight of the reckoning they had ignored for too long. The mistress sank into her chair, the pearl necklace slipping slightly, a symbol of pride undone by the subtle, relentless force of truth. The guests, still recovering from the sudden collapse of certainty, exchanged fearful glances. The night was no longer theirs, and yet it remained calm, almost reverent in its assertion of justice. Ellison stepped back, allowing the trio to fade into the shadows once more. The storm had passed silently, leaving the hall transformed. No one above understood the full scale of the force that had moved among them, but all felt its impact. The invisible had left its mark. Balance had been restored not through rage or destruction, but through deliberate, unwavering action. The candles flickered one last time before settling into a steady glow. The hall exhaled. The music, tentative now, began again, softer, quieter, carrying with it the hum of lessons learned too late. Ellison, Layla, and Jonah disappeared into the corridors from which they had emerged, leaving behind a hall forever changed, a story forever remembered.